So this is James, and I'm here with
Kody.
and we are going to be discussing the Anarcho-Syndicalist revolution that took place in Spain in 1936 into 1937, focusing primarily on forms of organization, but also providing broader history. This was prepared in part for an anarchism seminar that we'd been participating in, and there are a couple key sources that I'm drawing from in particular in order to provide you some of this historical background and details on the forms of organization that were so crucial for the anarchist revolution. Those include Rudolf Rocker's Anarcho-Syndicalism Theory and Practice, which is a seminal text in Anarcho-Syndicalist theory. A more recent edition of that book has a preface by Noam Chomsky, famous libertarian socialist thinker, who's also written about the anarchist civil war and the revolution that took place at the same time. Especially in his book on anarchism, there is a chapter on, it's called Part 2 on Objectivity and Liberal Scholarship, and he does some really good analysis of some of the media coverage and also some of the scholarship about the Spanish Civil War and where it falls short. I'm also drawing slightly from Volume 1, this book, The CNT and the Spanish Revolution, which was authored by Jose Parras, who was a member of the CNT, and it has been published more recently, I guess, by the Meltzer Press. And from what I gather, and I haven't actually finished this book, but I was sort of dancing around it. Parras was facing mass immiseration and repression and dealing with poverty while trying to write this book. And I guess former members of the CNT, or maybe members that sort of went underground post-revolution, they had requested that he undertake this project and write about it. And I guess he was a former bricklayer, and so he was working in old CNT offices trying to write this that were frigid cold in the winter, and he had no money and was the little food. And the one thing they did have, or that they tried to accommodate him with, were warm bricks. They brought warm bricks that he could put his feet on while writing for hours on end. And so another key text is Murray Bookchin's collection of essays, To Remember Spain, the Anarchist and Syndicalist Revolution of 1936. Bookchin also has another book about, on the similar topic, the Spanish anarchist, The Heroic Years, 1868 to 1936. A little, I think, of what I have to say is maybe drawn from that too, or there's some parallels and crossover between the two. So we have been discussing Murray Bookchin a little bit in our seminar, Kody.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on Bookchin and sort of his philosophy?
Well, I find Bookchin to be very compatible with the current situation and the ideals that many anarchists or leftists in general might hold. I particularly like his merging of ecology with the social justice movements, of the variety of social justice movements, which is something that I feel can often be missing in other forms of anarchism, or in things like anarcho-syndicalism, which may use environmentalism as a selling point, saying that particular organizations will lead to less destruction or whatever, but never actually build in a sort of sustainable and ecologically oriented lifestyle and community into their framework for a free society, which I find quite admirable in Bookchin.
I've been reading, not to go off on too much of a tangent, but I have been reading Bookchin's The Ecology of Freedom, The Emergence and Dissolution of Hierarchy, which is a book that was published in 1982, and it was the text that the leader of the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, Abdullah Öcalan, read early on when he was imprisoned by the Turkish state. And Öcalan's PKK has, and his sort of change in thought, moving from a more Marxist-Leninist, nationalistic direction towards a kind of libertarian municipalism or democratic confederalism, sort of loosely based on the Bookchin model, and that has informed the ongoing social revolution in Rojava, in Syrian Kurdistan, which has been compared to the Anarcho-Syndicalist revolution in Spain in 1936 by prominent anarchist thinker David Graeber.
Did you happen to read what parts of Bookchin appealed to him that made him move away from like Leninism and such? Or
I think in his statements to the court, his defense statements, he might have articulated this. And I don't know if that was in Kurdish and if they're even available in English. Although I know Juice Jongardin is a scholar that has written about it a little bit, although with far less focus on the revolution in Rojava because it's so new, and more with some of the broader changes in the Kurdish movement that reflected some of these anti-authoritarian, non-statist, anti-capitalist ideas. But I'd be interested to know specifically what elements of it, like whether it was just like a compelling anti-authoritarian argument, or whether it was... Bookchin's partner, Janet Beale, who survives him, Bookchin passed away a few years ago, she had said in a talk that she gave that Bookchin believed that the best anarchists were former Marxist, which maybe that because he was a former Marxist might be a little personal bias in there, but because he believed that they knew how to think, they had a particular way of analyzing society historically, like a historical materialist perspective, which is, I think, also informs his approach in that book, The Ecology of Freedom, and some of his other work, where he's getting beyond the superficial, surface level appearances and thinking about like the genesis of things and how they came to be, and how society has changed as a result of not only contradictions within modes of production and human reproduction, that sort of thing, but also like conscious decisions, ways in which power has been exercised by certain groups over others. But yeah, I mean, the book is definitely worth reading. He starts, I think, in the first or second chapter, talking about pre-literate societies and their appeal vis-a-vis their rejection of hierarchy, like hierarchy not even being a structure that they even conceived of, just because it was like so foreign and not even just not in existence. And so like even their thought processes were different, like the way they thought about things and their language that externalized their thought about things. Like had the hierarchy was just hierarchy and like associated forms of domination and control were just not present.
That's interesting. You were just talking about how he thought the familiarity with Marxism was essential for anarchism, if not the better anarchist, as he would put it. And to me, that also ties into his critique of what he considers lifestyle anarchism, and this idea that just a change of attitudes or behaviors, or even just beliefs on the parts of anarchist or freedom-seeking individuals is not near enough, and that you need that historical materialist sort of backing to really start changing society. How does that tie into what you just brought up about his idealizing these groups that just they didn't have the concepts of hierarchy, which seems to fall a bit more in line with the sort of the lifestyle anarchism, which isn't lifestyle, but the idea that just by changing their beliefs and attitudes towards each other, they can create a more free and equal world.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I think Bookchin would say his critique of lifestyle anarchism was focused on those he termed lifestyle anarchists in the 1980s and 1990s. Not those. So those with existing those who are adopting this sort of individualistic framework and way of being within neoliberal capitalist society in ways that are completely compatible with capitalism. I don't know if I entirely agree, but one of the interesting things too is that many of the Spanish anarchists that Bookchin wrote so extensively about were self-identifying lifestyle anarchists. So, for example, and we'll get into this later, there were all forms of like nudist collectives, practices of veganism, trying to address forms of hierarchy, domination, oppression, control in all aspects of people's lives, and so totally changing their relationships with each other and with the world. So fundamentally, lifestyle alterations in ways that rejected the encroachments of capitalism and the marketplace and industrial production, and then it also, in some ways, brought out the best of the rich agrarian collective tradition, which is one of the reasons Bookchin cites he cites the agrarian collective tradition and its sort of fusion with a proletariat, working class, anti-capitalist consciousness coming together at like exactly the right point that enabled this revolution to take place. And then, like, to qualify that, like, I don't think he's projecting back on the past to say this is, to point to confluences that weren't there. I think he's just like he was trying to flesh out in the works that I cited before, some of these the interesting ways in which these things coalesced and clearly did allow for realization of more liberatory potentials, if only for a time. So one of the other texts that I was going to mention before we, I guess, delve much more deeper into this was Peter Marshall's book, Demanding the Impossible, A History of Anarchism. And what a history it is. This is about 800 pages worth of history, and surprisingly, a pretty short chapter on Spain. I don't know if you had a chance to take a look at it, Kody, but
I have not looked at that yet.
It's only about like 20-some pages or so, yet he condenses that rich history into those 20 pages in a way that really does justice, I think, to much of the anarchist tradition in Spain. And there's clearly much more that could be elaborated on and theorized, but it's a nice read. So some of what we'll be talking about is drawn from that one chapter in Marshall's book. There's also a book by Martha Acklesberg, Free Women of Spain, Anarchism and the Struggle for the Emancipation of Women. And Acklesberg, back in the 1970s or 1980s, traveled to Spain, conducted interviews with older women who had participated in the revolution, who were now in their 70s and 80s and 90s, and also interviewed more contemporary feminists and anarchists, and noted some of the generational differences, and also some of the disagreements, which in some cases had more to do with misunderstanding actually than actually differing viewpoints. Even despite the fact that, say, the women of Mujeres Libres were more active in the 1930s, and the feminists in the 1980s were clearly working in a different social and historical context. Like their anti-authoritarian views were in a lot of ways very similar, but the meanings that they attached to certain words, like feminism, even, for example, meant something very different. Like many of the women of Mujeres Libres rejected that label, despite being what we might now think of as like ardent feminists. But they were very adamant about, like, the revolution, including men, and the men obviously being integral to the revolution, but also needing an organization like Mujeres Libres, the Free Women of Spain, which came out of the CNT, which is the Anarcho-Syndicalist Union, because the union and Anarcho-Syndicalism generally was not adequately addressing issues like gender oppression.
That's interesting. I remember a section in there where they talked about feminism and how many of them they hadn't heard of feminism, actually, and they were surprised that so many people, when they would talk to them about that, like assumed it had like come from France or something and been like given to them or brought over.
Yeah.
When they were like, no, we're not like rehashing some feminist viewpoint we heard elsewhere. These are just ideals that we have come to ourselves, which happen to match up with some of these things that these people you call feminists over in the rest of Europe. And elsewhere. And I thought that was very interesting. Both the point that feminism, despite being obviously sharing values with them, was not itself embraced, but also that hint of what many have criticized some feminists for, that sort of white colonial feminism that like goes elsewhere to free women in these different areas, which is obviously not necessarily the case for these people searching for their own liberation.
So I figured we could maybe segue into. Notice I said segue this time. I received some flack for shortening my pronunciation of the word to just seg before. So I'll try to refrain from doing that. I'll try to say the word in its fullest articulation from this point forward. So, getting into some of the history, which I think is important. Like I mentioned before, Bookchin emphasizes that pre-capitalist collectivist tradition that resisted assimilation into what he considered, and what the Spanish anarchists considered, authoritarian capitalist forms of organization and production. And so, contra many Marxian analysts, Bookchin came to recognize that the industrial proletariat would not be the major catalyst of any revolution, or he was very skeptical of locating the locus of revolt there, precisely because he thought in industrial factory production and much of capitalist production services generally were incredibly dehumanizing and elicited the worst sensibilities and practices among people, and militated against the more emancipatory forms of organizing and thinking and being in the world. So like it served as like a bulwark against that sort of thing. Like beat people down was his basic point.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I mean, the idea that, because the opposing idea was that all of the alienation and discipline and punishment would cause people to revolt, right? Would lead to this rebellious consciousness, and there seemed to neglect the idea, which he is bringing out as a potential criticism, is that in fact that sometimes beating people down leads to obedience, right? It leads to submission because out of fear of or necessity for those individuals, and so I think that's a fine critique.
Which again is also contra Marx, who in Capital stresses the way that the capitalist mode of production brings workers together within a concentrated area, the factory floor, where cooperation is key, and that cooperation being crucial, a crucial aspect that could lead to proletarian organization and that sort of thing, which it might be true. Like there is certainly cooperation that goes on in the workplace. I think David Graeber refers to that sort of thing as like everyday communism. So, for example, if you're building something with somebody and you need a hammer, you might just ask for the hammer. You don't expect anything, and the person doesn't expect anything in return. When he or she hands you that hammer, just do it, because that's what you need that at that point.
And it's interesting that cooperation can be explored in many ways. So, for instance, usually in the industrial floor, you have cooperation meaning successfully following orders and not causing disruptions, right? Which is a form of cooperation, and it's thought of as what cooperation is on that floor, which is lacking, which I would say the more revolutionary aspects, which Marx was hoping for, which is that those workers would actually be making decisions and interacting with each other in a meaningful way, not just cooperating because, well, the policy says I go hand this part over down to this section of the factory, which is a form of cooperation, but is in no way liberating for the individual, and certainly not conscious raising for the individual.
It never ceases to amaze me the ways in which some of the best human qualities, attributes, and ways of relating to one another, how those end up being subordinated to the logics of capital and integrated into this fundamentally alienating process. That being what capital is, at least in some ways of defining it, like our alienated symbolic labor power turned over and against us. So one of the things that Bookchin, I guess, also argued was that the rich, like I said, that rich collectivist tradition, that agrarian collectivist tradition, which is not entirely unique to Spain, but there was a long and storied Spanish history of that sort of thing. That influenced the industrial working classes because it happened at this important historical moment where there was also a large influx of rural workers migrating into the cities. And I think Martha Ecclesburg as well talks about some of the reasons why. So there were liberal land reforms that were passed after 1835, and they transformed seigneurs into capitalists, essentially. It concentrated property and led to the expulsion of peasants from the lands they'd cultivated for generations. Some, but not all, of the commons. So enclosures of the commons were still going on at that time. And then just some serious sweeping privatization schemes. And I guess incipient early privatization schemes, which continue apace today, I might add. And so that increased, there was an increasing proletarianization of the populace and integration into the industrial capitalist workforce. And more submission, attempted submission to capitalist wage labor. That's what that was part of the class project, if you want to put it that way.
And it's interesting that Bookchin's criticism sort of comes out there. Many people talk very often about Marx's contradictions within capitalism, but I would say that this would be one of those contradictions within Marxism, which is the idea that as more and more people were pulled to the cities for industry, right? As it kept pulling these farmers and pulling those living hunter-gatherer, nomadic lifestyles, all that into the city, that there would be more and more resistance to capital because they were all a part of it. But of course, that very resistance was implying that capitalism was successfully expanding and getting those people to join it, right? Which I think is problematic because in order for the workers to realize the horrendous nature of capitalism and the way it was hurting themselves, they had to already be a part of it. And so in fact, all these groups that were outside of capitalism at the time, that were having alternative economies and alternative social relations, were being swallowed up by it. And the Marxists would say that was, in a way, a good thing because it was bringing more of the proletariat to consciousness about the problems of capitalism. But by its very nature was putting them in the position where capitalism was exploiting them and prospering based on that.
Yeah. And so there are differing views about the extent to which Spain was industrialized in the 1930s on the eve of the revolution. Ecclesburg, I think, argues that it was still largely agrarian with pockets of industrialization. Bookchin, like I suggested, takes a more dialectical view as well, and even Ecclesburg does, at least provides elements that would support this argument that because of that influx and this key critical juncture in which there were mass enclosures and privatization and concentration of property that were going on at the same time that industry was beginning to expand, that there was more than pockets of industrialization. There was society was in flux in a lot of ways, and that's sort of my understanding of it as well. So Spanish peasants, too, something Peter Marshall points out, that they were also pushing for redistribution of land and the end to the authority of the landowner and priest and police. The clergy is important, too. So that was one of the major anarchist critiques in Spain, especially. In fact, I think after the revolution started, we'll get to how that started later, but the black flags, or the black and red flags, were draped over old church buildings because Catholicism was so authoritarian and repressive, and very much integrated into forms of class rule. So Bookchin also mentions the libertarian organizational forms that synthesized that collectivist tradition with the urban industrial economy, and how this infused or wasn't infused by anarchist ideas, and those ideas were espoused and propagated by those who were known as the apostles of the idea, and it had huge success in places like Saragossa, where one of the major anarcho-syndicalist conferences took place. Is known as Black Saragossa, black meaning referring to the anarchist color, denoting how thoroughly anarchist the city had become. And there were strikes, for example, not just industrial strikes, but what was even more common and what many of the anarchists there were more enthusiastic about were strikes for comrades in prison to get them out. Especially, I mean, there were all sorts of political prisoners at the time, those who were brought into prison and because they faced repression for challenging capitalist rule and that sort of thing, or just generally identifying even as anarchists. In fact, a little historical note that Bookchin has mentioned before is that the term anarchist and libertarian. So now, those who identify in the United States as libertarians are essentially proprietarians, who without maybe even realizing it, are calling for some of the most brutal and repressive state intervention imaginable because they want to protect their private property regimes, and they also usually implicitly support the rule of unaccountable private tyrannies in the form of large corporations. But libertarian, of course, has often been used synonymously historically with anarchism. And Elisée Reclus, famous French anarchist, prominent writer, he sort of popularized the adoption of the term libertarian to refer to anarchists because if repression became increasingly common. This was back in the late 19th century, and so if you were identifying as an anarchist, then you were going to face jail time. So it's interesting to think about like the ways that these terms and the meanings associated with them. Always interesting to think about how those have evolved and continue to evolve. So one of the other things that Bookchin mentions in his book To Remember Spain is and Bookchin's not the only one too. I think Martha Ecclesburg and Shirley Marshall and others talk about it, is the importance placed on pedagogy, like I was kind of suggesting before, like with the apostles of the idea. So you would have this like traveling band of radical anarchist pedagogues that would go from city to city in Spain, and sort of and I think Marshall does a good job of fleshing this out. There was like real millenarian, almost religious aspect to it too, because many firmly believed that their ideas were, if materialized, were going to bring about a free humanity, and so like they had this almost prophetic vision, if you will. Now that gets, I think, misinterpreted by folks like Eric Hobsbawm, who's otherwise was a very good Marxist historiographer. Wrote an excellent book, The Age of Revolution and also The Age of Capital. But he's critiqued in Chomsky's book on anarchism, for example, about his writing on the Spanish Civil War. And in Bookchin's text, too, they refer to Hobsbawm's book Primitive Rebels, and also to an article that he wrote for the New Left Review, and he blamed the failure of the revolution on the anarchists, which seems like a real like inversion of history there. And he also, in some of his other writings, very very dismissive of non-Marxist statist revolutionary programs. So dismissive, say, during the French Revolution, of the sans-culottes and the underlying subterranean municipalist revolution that was taking place and almost overthrew the left-wing Jacobin government when they were less responsive to the people. Did you have thoughts on that?
not surprised by the continual rejection of Marxists, of workers' own thoughts. Like, it's very interesting that if they were of several sort of like grassroots organizing, anarcho-syndicalist oriented folk, that you would see that as being the proletariat being very self-aware of their class position and very obviously fighting it, but instead you often see the Marxists, because they don't take the statist line or don't follow a particular ideological strain within Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, whatever, that they need to be guided or retaught how to do the revolution, how to make themselves liberated and unexploited. Which for me has been one of the primary concerns with the more authoritarian left, is that they don't trust the people enough, even though the proletariat is their revolutionary class, is that they don't trust them to make it properly.
That reminds me, I guess, two things that I've been thinking about a lot lately, especially after reading some of the texts that we've been talking about. One is Bookchin has a really lengthy footnote there, and also some of it's in the main body of the text, about Spanish anarchist views and practice vis-a-vis leadership and this notion of a vanguard. And what's interesting is that they fervently eschewed leadership, but at least in rhetoric, and in a lot of cases, of course, also in practice, clearly. But yet, what ended up happening oftentimes was, rather than referring to somebody as a leader, they used the phrase influential militant. And so that ended up just glossing over the fact that there were emerging these, in some cases, authoritarian leaders, or even just structures, authoritarian structures that empowered some people over others. But yet they were also very adamant about the fact, again tied to this sort of prophetic vision and praxis, that they did constitute a vanguard. I mean, you too could be part of the vanguard, but we have this level of critical consciousness, what Paulo Freire would call anti-authoritarian, that those who don't, say, adhere to this non-authoritarian anti-capitalist vision and identify these sources of oppression, that they either don't have or they aren't acting on. And so it's our job to, if you want to put it crassly, propagandize or educate, in collaboration with others, of course, learning and adapting and changing things based on dialogue and what have you, but also, not shying away from the fact that we want an anarchist revolution, right?
The way I've heard this contrast brought to light is to compare the concept of a vanguard with the concept of a catalyst group among anarchists. So the difference being the orientation, and that is, with the vanguard, you have this revolutionary conscious party or group.
Yeah, it usually takes the form of a party.
Yeah, too. Exactly. And the idea is that you help others realize that their interests are in alignment with the party, or that to truly reach the values, they need to submit themselves to the party and join up with it. Whereas in the catalyst group, it's oriented in the opposite direction. So anarchists may have certain ideals or even projects or methods for attaining liberation and getting rid of exploitation. But the goal is to inspire people to do it themselves. So they may say, well, hey, let's think about your life. Like, you're working 40 hours a week. You don't get a single say in your behavior or activities during the day. You don't get to set your schedule and all these. Do you feel free? And to convince them that they don't, and then ask them what they want to do about it, how they want to do about it, and to start working it that way. And so the idea is, instead of being the point that everyone falls behind to push the revolution forward, instead to be the spark that allows the revolution to sort of take off on its own. And, I mean, of course, Marxists and anarchists have debated for a long, long time over which one could actually cause a revolution to occur. But it's just an interesting difference of orientation and where it puts the agency, because the one very much puts the agency in the party, which requires worker agency to help the party, but the other one doesn't require that at all. Instead, just puts the agency with the workers themselves, and just may require people to have that spark of insight, as you mentioned, like those who have had the more deep critique of capitalism and statism and authority that are causing the real issues for the workers.
And it'll be interesting to explore later the ways in which, both in the realm of rhetoric, but also in practice, the shift towards more statist, you might even argue party-oriented forms, even under a communist or communistic banner toward the end of the revolution, was fundamentally counter-revolutionary in Spain, and then it'll also be interesting to maybe talk about once we get to the onset of the revolution, after providing this backdrop, like want to make sure that we do the way in which there was. I mean, it was in many ways totally spontaneous, in reaction to an attempted fascist coup, but came following decades of this organizing and consciousness raising. So, in terms of the urban organization, like I mentioned before, and I guess it's worth reiterating that the anarchists made concerted efforts to transform the nature of factory work itself, and that was part of their, I think, vision, their anarcho-syndicalist vision, for a freer society, and the anarcho-syndicalist form of organization as like the germ of the future society. So they recognized that industrial capitalist work blunted human potentialities, and they also, importantly, shifted the focus from just a common enemy, the capitalist, the landowner, etc. Although that was arguably also strengthened the common opposition to that, but they shifted the focus to a shared meaningful life, which again drawing on this rich agrarian collectivist tradition, and so they adopted organizational forms to promote changes in fundamental behavior patterns. And like I said, some of this was all wrapped up in what was often, prophetic and millenarian, if not religious type rhetoric, but again based on a clear and, you might argue, rigorous analysis of the social conditions of repression. And it sort of wrapped up in that too was this adoption of a real puritanical strain amid economic deprivation. So by that, Marshall talks about a little bit in his chapter on Spain, the ways in which many of the revolutionaries thought it necessary to forego, say, alcohol, which was in their eyes fundamentally militating against the kind of organizing they thought necessary in order to bring about this revolutionary social transformation. And then so it was more, I guess the way that I thought about it when reading was sort of parallels with, say, maybe the Zapatistas, for example, where there's a lot of collective self-discipline involved in their forms of organization, also in the EZLN, their military wing, which is necessary to protect against the state, always trying to encroach on their autonomous forms of organization, and also the discipline that's necessary to try to create a freer society amid a neoliberal capitalist hellscape, right? And then so conditions were obviously different in 1930 in Spain, yet there's always that tension, I think, when trying to implement forms of what we now refer to as prefigurative politics, adopting the structures of organization or the ways of relating to one another that we'd like to see reflected in the future society we're trying to create, and doing that in the present as part of the movement, or as, say, in Spain, as part of the ways in which the union itself, the Anarcho-Syndicalist Union, was structured. And interestingly enough, I was going to mention this before, there's a quote from Subcomandante Marcos, the Zapatista spokesperson for so long, after the 1994 rebellion in Chiapas, Mexico. And I guess Marcos has since, just recently, after the assassination of the pedagogue Galeano, Marcos has ceased to exist, and now it's Subcomandante Galeano, I believe. But while still Marcos, he had said that I shit on all vanguards. So I thought that was great. So the Spanish Federation in the International Working Man's Association took shape in June 1870. So you can date some of these early developments that far back that were key in realizing decades later the catalyst of the revolution. And so back in the Spanish Federation and the International Working Man's Association, they proposed a syndicalist structure, and it had a key dual structure. So there was organization by trade and also organization by locality. So addressing those who live within the same neighborhoods and geographical locale, but then also those who are laboring within the same trade under the same conditions, similar conditions. And Giuseppe Fanelli was the, I think, Italian thinker who introduced the Russian Bakuninist collectivist anarchist tradition into Spain in 1868, according to Martha Ecclesberg. And so, I mean, that's just interesting to think about. Like, we're all across the continent there. So you have, like, Bakunin, who's a famous anarchist thinker, who's Russian. And, of course, although he traveled all across the place, he was a perpetual revolutionist. In 1848, example, he was in France, and then was in Dresden for their last stand, fighting alongside the artist and writer Richard Wagner, but yet Russian. And then Giuseppe Fanelli, Italian, and those being very influential for the development of Spanish anarchism, which was arguably the most took those ideas and realized them in the most revolutionary way in the material world. And so the Spanish section of the First International, the Federación Regional Española, was set up by Fanelli, and there was a section that developed in an anarcho-syndicalist direction. So in 1888, they made a commitment to anarcho-communism, which was sort of, I think, the foundation for the anarcho-syndicalist praxis. And the Libertarian Unions of Catalonia formed Solidaridad Obrera, Workers' Unity, in 1907. And then around the same time, there was all sorts of community-based direct action that was taking place. So in 1909, there was a week known as the Tragic Week, which involved a general strike. It was a general strike that was called in response to the Spanish waging war in Morocco, and so street battles ensued, and some 200 workers ended up dead, and thousands were injured. The women, in fact, were some of the primary organizers of the uprising, the rebellion, the anti-war organizing, and they were also during the Tragic Week, and then in some of the other strikes that took place around the same time, they were some of the most militant. So while, like, the men would be quicker to compromise with the employers, like, the women were like, no, we got to hold out. Like, we're not accepting those their pittances. We're holding out. But one of the things that interested me about the Tragic Week in particular was the impetus for it, it being an anti-war effort. So, of course, the Anarcho-Syndicalist revolution that we're talking about took place amid a civil war, arguably partly as a result of the Civil War. And there was, of course, the necessity of arming workers, not just to overthrow anything, but actually to fight back fascism. But I don't know. Do you think, Kody, that there is a dearth of anti-war organizing among anarchist circles today?
I'm not sure on that one. I feel that anti-war has taken a sort of back seat to several other issues, particularly in current times, whether that be like the problems of police brutality, prisons, and debt have taken a much more frontal role in what the anarchist critique. But certainly the anti-war has always been there. But being from the U.S., I can't say I haven't noticed that the anti-war movement has really, really diminished, or at least in its volume. You don't hear as much as you did, let's say, during the Bush years, when it was quite strong. Actually, it was considered to be one of the more radical and dangerous movements in the U.S. Dangerous to the establishment, that is.
Yes. And yet the permanent war economy continues unabated.
And not only that, but it's been restructured in very devious ways, particularly with drone strikes, right, and the daily bombing and daily death of innocents, which it surprises me that the anti-war front is not more active than it is. But I would say in anarchist circles, at least, that's always assumed. So
one of the likewise dangerous ideas that I think we had at a previous seminar was so we were talking about how prevalent offshoring of production is now, and so efforts at workplace takeovers and workers' control that might have found resonance in decades past are arguably not as applicable now, or possible even. Yet one of the major industries that we mentioned and made us think a little bit was the military-industrial complex. And so, to my knowledge, there is a significant portion of munitions and military equipment that is still produced in the United States. And so it did get me thinking, what would workers' control of that sort of thing entail, and what would be the implications?
The interesting feature, because for one is that manufacture has been kept in the U.S., but not entirely, because it was tried to be outsourced. I remember a few years back there was an article when a bunch of munitions gotten from China had turned out to be made intentionally defective because China happens to not have very much interest in U.S. hegemony elsewhere. So this the neoliberal outsourcing project sort of backfired on the American empire because they were getting their weapons of war from enemies, at least enemies of the empire. Worker control of those factories within the U.S. and its territories, I feel, one, that could be very liberating in their personal life, just, workers' control can do that. But if it's just a worker-controlled military-industrial complex, I'm not sure we will have achieved many of the goals we set out to just because they are, equal on the work floor, but still producing missiles that are killing people who are obviously not considered equal to them.
Yeah, that was not my my vision for a worker-owned and operated paradise.
Certainly, and so something where the workers took over the factory, turned it into a worker co-op, and then started making solar panels instead of missiles. I think would be right there in line with the goals we have at hand.
There's a large number of parents of my friends that say worked at Boeing, and I also know people that have worked at Lockheed Martin, and I think there are key sites that are part of the military-industrial complex in the area, if not like in the St. Louis area, then in the broader Chicagoland area and northern parts of Illinois. So it just because it seems like it's something that's based here. It's like one of the few remaining sites of industrial production that have not been subject to the mass deindustrialization that has wreaked such havoc upon the Midwest economy and the people that are a part of it and hurt worst. So speaking of people being hurt, so in the tragic week, there was massive repression that followed after 1909, and it sort of brought about this realization among many of the organizers that they needed to create a stronger organization. If also, and by stronger, that just means, I think for them, meant something that had certain structures, but was also incredibly decentralized. In fact, when repression ensued later, one of the reasons that the CNT was able to reemerge after years of being underground was because they were so decentralized. But after the tragic week, there was this recognition that some form of organization seemed necessary. And so they formed the CNT, the Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, that emerged in 1911. So it should really be seen not as like this founding of an entirely new organization, but more as a successor in this longer history of the Spanish libertarian section, the First International, and the forms of organization that cropped up as a result of some of the key decisions that were made there. And so there was a general strike again in 1913, and again women refused male compromises to return to work until there was a law that was on the books that was going to guarantee some of the basic workplace protections that they were going on strike for. And then in 1917 through 1923, the CNT continued organizing these revolutionary strikes across Spain and almost provoked a civil war then. In fact, some historians have argued that the anarchists are responsible for the Civil War because they're responsible for the fascist backlash, which even if first off, like if that was true, like I still would not say that should prevent anybody from trying to organize for a anti-authoritarian, anti-capitalist revolution, but I also don't think it's true. Based on some of the research that I've done and the myriad sources that I've turned to, it seemed like even the Republican government, the Popular Front government that was elected, was enough to irk the fascists because it was a unification of sort of center leftists, and Franco was going to do his thing regardless. And you go ahead.
I would just add that any sort of successful anarchist struggles should expect that backlash, right? Like, so it's odd to necessarily blame them for it, but of course, if you're trying to eliminate authoritarian structures and exploitive power relations, those that are benefiting from them might try to defend those positions, right? And so I would say that that's a sign of success, actually, is when the fascists are very openly organizing against you, is because they've realized there's a real threat to their maintaining their current privileges and power.
And of course, there's the common critique that there's perpetual war, regardless, right? So, I mean, being overly concerned about doing things that are going to result in fascist or extreme right-wing forces waging a civil war, like the point in some ways is almost kind of moot because there's massive violence that's carried out every day and continues today. So I would suggest that the same criticisms that we just espoused probably still apply.
And certainly, speaking of today, like the Black Lives Matter campaign has also increased Klan activity, very obviously in organizing. And I don't think that that's a criticism you can level against the Black Lives Matter campaign just because the Klan is trying to respond to this.
You just need to tone it down a little bit. You need to realize what you're doing, okay? And, similarly, I was just listening to a talk that Carrie Liderson, a journalist who used to write for the Washington Post, and also Midwest Energy News, based in Chicago. She's based in Chicago. Has also done amazing freelance work for labor-oriented outlets like In These Times, and also wrote the book Revolt on Goose Island about a workplace takeover in Chicago in one of the remaining industrial strongholds there. That's actually been transformed into New Era Windows, which is democratically owned and democratically controlled by the workers now, after which was enabled by that takeover when it was still republic. But one of the things that she talked about, because she also did some investigatory journalism work in Latin America, she spent some time in Venezuela, and covered as well the mass influx of immigration, dating back, well, you go much farther, but to the implementation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, which not only hurt workers in the United States, it made workers in Mexico, agricultural producers, have to compete with U.S. backed agribusiness, and resulted in mass unemployment, and contributed to the so-called immigration crisis. And one of the other things that she mentioned in this talk that I was listening to was, and I guess she spent some time with them, which is maybe a little scary, a group of right-wing militants who have assumed the role of protecting the border, because the massively militarized border that we have is not good enough for them, so they go out in full-on military gear with their night goggles and everything, and carry guns, of course, because there are loose gun laws in Arizona and Texas, and they set about trying to keep anyone from crossing the border, and they say that they don't ever shoot anybody, although they always have their guns. They don't ever shoot anybody. They turn them over to law enforcement, but essentially assuming vigilante type roles in a particular way that's also extremely xenophobic and racist. So like at some of their meetings, like Liderson attended, there were, say, Hispanic persons who came from immigrant backgrounds, and they were talking about how like they very much love their neighborhood and the people there, and they also work and pay their taxes and everything else, but they also are very, very proud of, say, like their indigenous background or their Mexican heritage and everything else, and so they were actually pushed out of the meeting, and like the police were called. The police were called, who of course responded, I guess, to this call from the vigilante right wing group, and the police dragged the Latino persons out of the meeting, and dragged some of the other, I guess, leftist radicals and progressives that attended to try to dialogue with these people. They were taken out of the meeting.
Interesting.
And so to return, I'm glad that we do these tangents, because it's always good to see the parallels, the historical parallels, and the relevance for the present, and the way that some of the same issues persist. So the CNT organized a conference in 1919, and there they adopted the principles of Comunismo Libertario as the basic ideology, and they proposed a regional conference of Catalan unions the year before as well. And so there was a Zaragoza conference, the first famous Zaragoza conference in 1922, and it's there that the CNT proclaimed itself a defender of the principles of the First International, as outlined by Bakunin, and they broke with the Communist Third International because of the Soviet Union's dominance. And then, like I said before, they went underground for about 7 years during the Rivera dictatorship from 1923 to 1930, and were able to reemerge largely intact because of their decentralized structure. And then in the early 1930s, there were many attempts to set up anarchist insurrectional communes, including at Casas Viejas, where they unfurled the red and black flag and locked up civil guards before Many were burned alive in a shepherd's hut. And then in 1932, there was another attempted general strike in Sevilla. And then in 1933, there were riots in Barcelona. And the CNT and socialist UGT, the Union General de Trabajadores, supported the strike of some 70,000 miners in Asturias in October 1934, which is a key historical point that Bookchin makes a point of emphasizing that often gets downplayed or overlooked when people talk about the 1936 revolution.
It's interesting, in labor history in general, miners have consistently held a very, very central role in conflict with capital, both due to, obviously, the capitalist relations inherent in owning, let's say, a mine or whatever, but also the horrendous conditions a lot of miners were forced under. But with the acceleration of technology and use of technology, as well, of course, the standard union busting tactics that have been used, you don't hear about miners striking as much, largely because a lot of that's been replaced by industrial technology, which has removed one of the major thorns, I feel, in the capitalist project.
There's a book by Jeff Biggers, who's an author who's written other books like The United States of Appalachia, In the Sierra Madre, and State Out of the Union. And one of his more recent ones is Reckoning at Eagle Creek, The Secret Legacy of Coal in the Heartland. And it's published by Southern Illinois University Press. And it speaks to many of the militant unionism among coal miners in the Southern Illinois area. I'm not particularly a Biggers fan. I felt somewhat shooed away when I had a question to ask, and was actually I was leveling a critique of capitalism, because he I guess maybe partly in this book and then some of the other stuff that he's been working on more recently, trying to formulate and spell out aspects of alternative economics, regenerative economics, is I think the way that he referred to it, and so I was pointing to overtly anti-capitalist attempts to create alternative forms of production and subsistence and ways that humans can go about reproducing themselves that aren't inherently destructive. And I was shooed away a little bit. So, but yet, his book is still worth checking out, especially if you're interested in some of that history that really does need to be recovered, much like the history of the anarchists in Spain. So what I was going to do now is sort of shift a little bit into the principles of anarcho-syndicalist organization, and then as I'm going through that, we can talk a little bit about the actual advent of revolution, if that's okay.
Sounds good.
So, and this I believe not only applies to Spain, but in these broader principles of anarcho-syndicalist organization, but to that form of praxis more generally. So the idea being that workers in each locality would join unions for their respective trades. The local unions would be subject to no central authority and retain the right to self-determination, largely autonomous decision-making. Trade unions in the city would combine into a labor cartel. I don't particularly like that word, but labor cartel to constitute centers for city-based propaganda and education, uniting the workers as a class, and arranging solidaric cooperation when one trade union would be in trouble, so that all the labor cartels that are grouped together on the regional and district level could help. And those cartels that are grouped together would form the National Federation of Labor Cartels. They would coordinate with inter-cartel and inter-regional education and aid when the stronger cartels needed to assist the weaker locals. And the labor organization would determine the total production and consumption needs throughout the country, and would adjust production accordingly. So in some ways, elements of what we now think of, say, participatory economics, I don't think the level of early stage planning So, or annual or cyclical planning was involved, even at the decentralized level. I think it was more of an adjustment based on just a continual adjustment by the unions based on like the way things are being produced and consumed, which actually seems much more responsive if it worked, and it seems like it did work quite well for a time in Spain. And so every trade union was federally associated with all organizations in the same trade throughout the country, and these federal associations were then allied with all related trades. And you had the Federation of Industrial Alliances, which combined industrial alliance and arranged for cooperative action across space and trades, and would coordinate those famous general strikes. And they controlled the instruments of production and ensured separate production groups would have what they needed. So, just sort of in sum, there were two main points there. There was the organization of workshops by producers, which is a key point. So again, local autonomy within the workshop and those who are doing the production, and direction of work by labor councils elected by the producers, directly elected. And then number two, all of the country's production would be organized by industrial and agricultural alliances. And then I guess there was a third point as well, the organization of consumption by the labor cartels. And so the key point in number two is interesting, and I wanted us to maybe elaborate on the implications of that a little bit. So it's fundamentally anti-market. So the production was coordinated, like I said, in a semi-participatory way, not just like we have now with production for profit. And so it got eliminated forms of abstract labor, where one would sell their labor power on the market, and then there'd be production for the market and allocation via the market. So I wondered why is that important, Kody? Why do you think addressing the pitfalls of market society is integral for a more liberatory social transformation?
Well, the key part is the sort of terminal values you have. So the market is said to be highly efficient at distributing goods effectively, but that efficiency is based on purchasing power. And so what it does is it distributes resources in a way that make the most money for those involved, right? And as we see all the time throughout history and our day-to-day lives, that doesn't mean that that's in the best well-being of the communities, the laborers, or the macro-level economies, the nations themselves. Mm-hmm. And so that moving away from that to where you are producing based on needs, at least at first, and then desires, which we are certainly capable of beyond that, means that you are directly responding to demand, not this implicit demand that, oh, a number of dollars went towards this product must mean that's good, or the advertising was so effective here, which must mean that product's good. But instead, very real needs, like you need X amount of homes and you make them. And people need access to internet, so you start working on that, things like that. And it also avoids the excesses of the market, where goods are just mass-produced needlessly, and then, due to the very relations within the market, are denied to most people. This has been one of the age-old critiques within Marxism of capitalism, is that labor power, ability to purchase the products and be the consumers are supposed to play on the market, is one of the internal contradictions, because their wages are constantly being pushed lower, right? And their ability to contribute to the market, which is buy the own products that they're making, is problematic. So the market runs into all these issues where it's got, like in the U.S. where we are now, like 6 times as many empty houses as it has homeless people, mm-hmm. Which is just like strange. And not only in the sense of human well-being, which is being ignored, not only in the sense of market efficiency, which is failing because that's extremely inefficient, but also, that's horrible for the environment. And to have produced all these excess houses and used up all the excess land, which was unnecessary. So I feel that moving towards that worker-oriented solutions in both production and consumption will lead to a more rational way of organizing our society, and also certainly a more egalitarian and friendly way of organizing our society.
So Michael Albert, who's the founder of ZNet, also spearheaded South End Press while it was still up and going, and did that on, I guess, based loosely on his model of participatory economics, or par-econ. And he is a staunch market abolitionist. And I tend to agree with much of his criticism of markets in that regard. So Albert argues that they disastrously distort human relations, because, like, if we think of a market, and I guess a working definition that I use, and you can tweak it too, and I would, I guess, qualify this by saying, as a human institution, markets are somewhat malleable, and markets function in different ways in different historical periods. But generally, it refers to the allocation via competitive buying and selling, prices determined by competitive offerings of the buyers and sellers. Now, that definition, in my mind, does not adequately account for monopolistic practices, much of Marx's dialectical criticism in Capital didn't actually account for monopolistic practices, because it was immanent criticism that adopted the frameworks of the classical political economists like Adam Smith and Ricardo, and showed how, like, just within those parameters, he took them to conclusions that were extremely revolutionary based on their own premises, and pointed out the contradictions within that would lead to those revolutionary conclusions.
And implicit in that sort of understanding of the market is this idea that the market can actually respond to everyone's desires by them competitively being on the market. But of course, the reality has always been, and still is, that there are many people, possibly most people, but many people at least, that don't have access to the market. They don't have the money, the purchasing power to even get the supply or demand numbers in there. So it's one of the things that's never really talked about in market theory is that any sort of efficiency or distribution that's going on is among a very select class of individuals which even can participate in the market. And there's all these others which are not allowed to participate, which means the market is certainly not calculating their needs or interest in its market price or whatever.
Another curious aspect of market society is that marketing and advertising, if we lump that in there, fundamentally undermines markets, at least the way markets are professed to function, right? So it generates all these arbitrary needs and desires, and creates irrational consumers that are fundamentally misguided about the purchases that they're expected to make and need to make in order for capitalism to reproduce itself. And so, just real quickly, I did want to share some of the propositions that Michael Albert offers about markets, because I think it has a special relevance for us now, and we can maybe think about the ways in which the CNT, the way that they reorganize production, as well as the agrarian collectives they work closely with, like how that addressed some of these issues that are intrinsic to market institutions. So Albert suggests that, like you suggested too, Kody, that markets are incredibly inept at allocating things to people, one, like, based on needs, and permitting any form of equitable acquisition, precise, and there's a reason too that a lot of people, I guess, don't always think about. So Albert argued that people have different abilities to benefit and produce for others, and therefore different abilities to secure a more favorable share of the benefits of exchange. So if you think about it from the production side, not everybody has the same level of strength or intellect, however you want to define that, and especially when the value of this is evaluated through exchange value processes, which are for so many reasons distorted, that if I'm, say, a 6'5" guy that's cutting wood, and that's what I have access to is wood and something to cut it with, and then say there's my neighbor, who that also is what he has readily access to, is wood and something to cut it with, and that's what we're both doing. And my neighbor happens to be 4'11" and 90 pounds. I am at a serious advantage. He's at a serious disadvantage because of our genetic endowments and perhaps other various aspects of our life that might have allowed me to gain more muscle mass than him. And so because of that, because of genetic endowments, like say Michael Jordan's was a much better basketball player than me, he can glean a much better price for his labor than I can.
Than most people can.
Than most people can. And that's the way that remuneration is determined within the market society with wage labor. But even without, like if we were just selling our own products, the products of our own labor, there it's doesn't account for these inequities, and that might, and so the other. Go ahead.
As we're saying, with that, like you already have then one of the first filters, which is that not only is how it's going to distribute change depending on the abilities and attributes of those involved, but you've already knocked out some people of the market, right?
Yeah.
Like those who might be paralyzed or who have various disabilities or needs which prevent them from acting as an effective labor on the market are left to die if there's not some other means of getting them those resources, right? And so that you already have this class which is cut off, which is anyone who is not a healthy individual. And you see that's like social Darwinism is sort of built into the market then.
And it becomes a very vicious cycle because, say, that stronger woodcutter, and of course we could use a similar analysis with things that aren't just limited to woodcutting, but that person can demand more in the market and garner much greater purchases, which is going to eliminate the possibility of in the woodcutting example, the person who's 4'11" and 90 some pounds from getting any form of remuneration on the market. And not only that, but I think to sort of expound upon the point that you just made, there's all sorts in existing society, all sorts of social stratification that impacts and engenders different kinds of cultural capital that allows us greater access to markets and also to realizing our value on the market in different ways. And there's different senses of empowerment and confidence to exercise agency that are associated with that cultural capital, which of course influence our ability to realize our value on the market for yourself or others. And so Albert put forth another proposition that if any of the abilities to benefit others and secure better benefits from exchange do or should bestow a moral claim to benefit more or exercise more decision-making power, that is, those abilities should not be a guarantee, a moral guarantee that you can exercise more decision-making power than somebody else just because they don't have those abilities. And markets permit those with greater innate and learned abilities, at least I would argue and Albert argues, to reap more economic rewards and attain more, even when they, say, exert less effort or endure less hardship or onerousness or sacrifice less. And so some of a person's abilities can have to do with, say, just withstanding ability to reach agreements with others. like a single mother with a sick child is at a disadvantage in that way because she cannot bargain for forever. She has these circumstances that are going to compel her to reach an agreement that is less economically advantageous as somebody who can hold out longer because they don't have a sick child.
And but this is one of the other sort of hidden parts of the so-called efficiency of the market. The idea is that those who provide the best services or the best products are the ones who get the most or get the most consumers coming to them. Mm-hmm. But it's also those who can manipulate consumers the most, those who can be deceitful and about the product they're giving effectively, also is a greatly profitable activity. And so those that are good swindlers excel on the market, which is not something you would think that a society that wants to look for freedom and equality would be promoting, and the competitive market atmosphere certainly promotes those who are the most able to deceive and manipulate others to excel.
And that's actually something I wish Albert would have emphasized more. So another one of his propositions was that market exchanges permit those with greater abilities to benefit more or exercise greater economic and social power than those with lesser abilities. But it's also those with greater manipulative abilities too that are enabled to do that. And so value within market systems are determined by either distribution of income, enabling actors to manifest those needs and desires and demand more, or in, say, even like a non-money economy that's still market-based, by people's abilities or access to products others deem desirable. So one of the points that I think we had talked about before was that market valuations also don't factor in externalities. So that's not an essential valuation that's part of market transactions. So, say you're producing a commodity and you're producing it for sale on the market, and in the process of production, say the labor conditions probably are not very nice, and say you're doing all kinds of ecological destruction, that's not a primary consideration for you in that process of production, or even say after you sell a product which might itself be ecologically destructive, because within this institutional context, the primary objective is realizing profit on the market, or even just if we weren't in capital, but even within a market society, it would be for sale on the market. It would be part of that abstract labor logic.
And with that in the market, it not only does it lead to that sort of externalizing all things which come into conflict with profitability, but it actually externalizes all values besides profit. So for instance, you get a lot of profit by developing a woods, let's say, into a shopping mall or something. But under market understanding, there can be no use for that forest by itself, right? There can be no value to it just by, there being greenery, there being life there. That isn't considered valuable at all. In fact, it's the only considered valuable when someone has developed it in some way, which may actually mean wiping it all out and laying down asphalt, which is a horrendous use of values from the environmentalist perspective, of course, because you're going to destroy your planet that way if you're just going to look for profit instead of any sort of ecologically sustainable means of it. Producing things in society, but also it makes it so that so many cultures and people their values are not even possible on the market because of that. If you want to be able to just enjoy the vast abundance that life has created here on Earth, in both food and hunting game, or just the transcendental experiences of being out in the woods and doing what, and enjoying the wildness of life, that's not an option under the market. Because that's not considered to be profitable, and if it's not profitable, it's completely valueless.
And so I guess my overarching critique, which when we've had previous discussions, I wish I would have stated more matter-of-factly before, was that acquisition of needed or even wanted goods and services shouldn't be based on contribution or output, for all of the reasons that we outlined before, because of the differential abilities of people to do those things that are based either on genetic endowment or on the particular social environment in which you as a human organism are raised, or and then part and parcel with that in contemporary society with the serious social and class stratification that we have that goes a long way in conditioning and determining the kinds of value gleaning abilities that you might be able to cultivate. And then I was also just going to add that quite obviously, market advantages, especially in existing society, can contribute to disproportionate exercise of political power by some, which is also important, also may be interesting to think about with relation to the CNT. To return finally back to the anarchist revolution in Spain and their forms of organizing, which were anti-market, anti-capitalist, and in some cases anti-money as as a commodity, as itself a commodity, the money commodity. It was abolished in places like Andalusia, which I'll maybe talk about a little bit more later, if we want. But I wanted to add that the anarcho-syndicalists in Spain, they firmly believed that the approach to socialism, and they, in a lot of ways, I think, saw anarchism and socialism as almost interchangeable in their vision. It was only possible when the workers had created the necessary organism for it and prepared for it through the socialistic education and direct action, which is itself a kind of pedagogy, entails a kind of learning by doing that was, I mean, I would say still is, it's absolutely necessary for anybody concerned with praxis or trying to change existing society, because the change cannot just take place within ideas alone, as powerful as those may be. And so, like I mentioned before, the form of organization that was adopted in Spain was the CNT. It was formed in 1911, and there were, so I guess it's kind of crucial to spell out the ways, the different levels of organization of the CNT. They had a national organization, a regional federation, and sindicatos, local sindicatos, which were grouped into geographic and trade federations. The local sindicatos were based on vocation. Those syndicates, those local sindicatos, they brought together all the workers in a factory or town, and they were loosely federated then at the regional and national levels. And the CNT had no permanent officials. The officers were unpaid. They rotated annually to prevent bureaucratization. The CNT Constitution agreed to accept a collective mandate made by majority decision. Federations were based on principle of near complete local autonomy. I think I stressed that before. So then they also had these regional congresses, which were interesting phenomenon. They were annual. There was a regional committee that was selected. The themes for the conferences had to be published in the union organ and disseminated so that workers could discuss these and instruct delegates beforehand, so they could read about it in the newspapers, discuss in the local syndicates, and then instruct the delegates that they would elect. And the local federation would convene in assemblies to promote that dialogue and discussion prior to the conferences, and then from there they'd elect the delegates.
Which is in stark contrast to the current closed doors negotiations that go on, which is then passed out as a bill, which is then disseminated to the public to look at about what the leaders decided and lobbyists decided. Yes, it is very, very interesting.
And then in conjunction with that, there were functioning worker centers, or centros obreros, that were established back in the International Working Men's Association days, which were essentially like local union offices, but also meeting places and cultural centers where some of these key decisions were made too. And again, they weren't, while key, because they established some of the fundamental principles that were adopted large scale, there was still that local autonomy within the workplace to decide, how best those that are most directly impacted want to manage their affairs. They had that decision-making power collectively. And so there was also a regional committee the CNT had, which was much like the national committee, and both were elected by those congresses. And then, so general agreements at national congresses were only the really binding resolutions that were passed. Congresses comprised of delegates were controlled by local members and could be dismissed at any time. They submitted propositions. Local unions would submit propositions, and they also had the mandate to discuss larger themes. The delegates could, so they would bring the propositions that their local union asked them to bring to those congresses, and then they had the liberty to also discuss some of the larger themes, and of course, exercise a little bit of their own agency if new issues arose within the Congress itself. And one of the lesser aspects of anarchism in Spain and forms of organization that is not emphasized enough, and for reasons that I think will become obvious, was the FAI, the Iberian Anarchist Federation, which conjoined with the CNT. It was a semi-clandestine, thoroughgoing anarchist form of organization that actually managed to pressure the CNT and push it in a more anarchistic direction. And it remained largely secret until the 1936 revolution broke out. And but prior to that, they'd done all sorts of organizing, largely in affinity groups of roughly about 12 people that would network together, and they ended up pushing out the more centrally oriented communists from the CNT, also the liberal reformers, and again turned it much more into an anarcho-syndicalist organization. And so one of the interesting things about that too was they had a national movement, the FAI did, that was coordinated by what was called the Peninsular Committee, and it was accused of being anarcho-Bolshevik in its orientation, and it was accused of trying to seize power in the CNT, but there was really no power to seize. Like, there was no central position of authority that was able to, impose decisions on others. That's just not how the union was structured. And so, after 1932, at least half the Spanish trade union movement was guided by dedicated anarchists. But, like I said, the CNT, or the FAI, didn't even come out into the open until the Spanish Civil War in 1936. And then it still continued to exert considerable influence, although it never had more than 30,000 members, while the CNT itself had about close to 1 million, I think, wow, at its peak. I think that's right. And so the CNT and FAI organizing, after Franco tried to overthrow the government and with his fascist forces, there was another conference in that place that I mentioned before, Zaragoza, another CNT conference in May 1936. And again, they reaffirmed their anarchist beliefs, and I'm going to read their statement. They said, "Once the violent aspect of the revolution is finished, the following are declared abolished: private property, the state, the principles of authority, and as a consequence, the classes which divide men into exploiters and exploited, oppressed and oppressors." So, that reminded me of previous discussions we'd had about after the Rev talk. After the Rev being after the revolution, which common in probably many Marxist and socialist circles, working with a particular conception of revolution, usually predicated on the seizure of state power, or for some more reform-minded, working within the system, election of those in the socialist or communist parties who will then wield state power and use state machinery to carry forth revolutionary measures and policies. That was clearly not the conception of revolution that they were working with in Spain. Yet I think there's more than modicum of truth to this line of thought that a serious social transformation is not going to take place right away, and there's going to be things that are not going to be nearly as complete as they might be, say, when you're not fighting fascists in a civil war, and also trying to eliminate capitalist modes of productions and the forms of relations and practices that are associated with that. Do you agree with that, or?
Yeah, I do, and I think, of course there will be large obstacles, just even in reworking what is the current capitalist economy to being geared towards meeting human needs and desires, right? That you gotta start dealing with the fact that, they're building the wrong things. We talked about building bombs instead of solar panels earlier, but also, you gotta get past the materials used that cause, like, planned obsolescence and various other things. But I think it was very interesting about that is that foresight of the future, because you talked about earlier with the markets, how they grant unequal political power. Mm-hmm. And one thing I've been thinking about is that, while that is true, I would extend it a little further and say, to interpret that very broadly, or might even just say social power, mm-hmm. because that the unequal relations we're talking about on the market lead to unequal relations in the home and unequal relations in any negotiation of contracts. So patriarchy is backed by the fact that for a long time men were the only ones who were participating in the market, or certainly had the advantage in the market, and led to complete different power dynamics within the house, which were very patriarchal and authoritarian, and led to men having a lot of control over women's lives, just out of necessity on the women's part of they couldn't make certain decisions or behave in certain ways because they could be cut off from their financial support base. And you see this also, in labor contracts, of course, when someone who's succeeding on the market, which is usually the entrepreneur, the corporation, the capitalist, has a whole lot to fall back on, right? Whereas the worker doesn't, so they can hold out in negotiations. Yeah. They can say, I don't really need your labor. I have others. I can just let that spot go even. Like, it's not necessary for me. Whereas the laborer has no choice but to try and obtain subsistence. So that political influence, which is certainly there, the ability to influence the state and influence social organizations and institutions, is also there at a much more personal level, just between any individuals and families that are interacting in that market. And that statement by the CNT of that future of talking about abolishing those authoritarian hierarchical relations, what that would look like, I think, even if they didn't see post-revolution in the same way, as the revolution being a single point, is a very ideal way of looking at the future. The goals you want to look at, which is that what they're doing isn't just creating a new organization, isn't just creating alternative economic system, but will, in fact, it'll filter down, it will end up contaminating, if you will, to use a sort of negative word, but contaminate every aspect of life, to make it more autonomous and more egalitarian.
Oh, and so I wanted to not exactly qualify, but I guess expound upon the membership numbers that I cited before. So this is interesting. The CNT had 500,000 members at the time of that Zaragoza conference in May 1936, which was just a few months prior to Francisco Franco's attempted coup in July. But their membership increased to 1.5 million, somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million, depending on who you ask, by the end of the year.
Wow.
And then it slowly, gradually declined with certain rapid accelerations and decline at certain key moments during repression that followed, and get to that again maybe a little bit later too. So at that same conference, the CNT issued a statement of libertarian communism and agreed that the new society should consist of communes based on freely associated syndicates, and again, the production and exchange of the necessities of life should take place through the regional and national federations, and elected committees in the communes would make decisions direct decisions regarding production. The Congress adopted the principle of what they called economic communism, and it was agreed that anyone who assisted the collective in accord with their strength and ability would receive from the commune satisfaction of their needs. So, which stands in stark contrast to market forms of distribution, where you essentially get what you can take, or the value that you can see realized on the market, whether it's through your superior endowments and abilities, or abilities that have been cultivated as a result of privilege, or through your manipulative tactics, like we talked about before.
Yeah, I mean, you can certainly see that despite being described as a meritocracy, you can have people working 80-hour work weeks year-round, which are barely making subsistence-level living under a wage. But then you can have people who, millionaire CEOs who get a good chunk, like a third of the year, in vacation days, right? Where the amount of labor being put into the market, the amount of effort and time being put into the market is not at all correlated with the reward reaped from the market.
Yeah. And then so at that conference, the CNT also called for the disappearance of the existing system of correctional justice. So while I don't know the specifics of, say, their anti-police praxis, I do think I do think it's true that they wanted the police abolished, at least police in the way that we think about them. Whether they wanted other forms of community control, I'm not really sure, although that'd be an interesting.
Do you know, in your research, were there any prisons liberated during this time? Like, were there any that was like so real anti-prison activity where prisoners were released or?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes, that did happen. The extent to which it happened and the details, I don't know as much, and it's not discussed nearly as much as I kind of wish it was in some of the sources that I listed before. But I know it is elsewhere, and in fact, maybe the volume 1 of the CNT and the Spanish Revolution by Jose Perez, I think maybe goes into it in some detail. Don't quote me on that. So one of the things that happened after Francisco Franco leading a fascist rebellion, I think it was the term that was bandied about was pronunciamiento, was what he was his attempted coup, was the way that it was referred to, and so he launched that in July, and there was an immediate spontaneous anarchist response, and they realized right away, many of the anarchists, that they couldn't just stop halfway. They're like, well, might as well carry forth the revolution while we're at it. And so what ended up happening was peasants collectivized their own land in Andalusia, Catalonia, and the Levant and Aragon, and some 3 million people were in rural collectives by 1937. And I'll talk in just a second, or in a moment anyway, about what happened to some of those collectives. And there were village communes in Andalusia where they abolished money, collectivized land, directly exchanged some goods. So not always under the auspices of union organization of production and distribution. And at least at one point in time, like the union, I think, encouraged that kind of spontaneous and autonomous activity. And the syndicates were turned into popular assemblies where the entire population was soon encouraged to attend, with women and children included. The assemblies then included an elected administrative committee that was entirely accountable to those participating in the assemblies, and the CNT committees in the village town assemblies shared decision-making power. There was a system of voluntary authority that was implemented, where no one was forced to join or remain a member of the collective, but they were subject to the authority of the General Assembly and usually to the decisions made by the local committees. They set up regional federations to coordinate the collectives, and because there was a serious shortage of raw supplies, worker-run factories really struggled eventually to try to support the militias. And what's interesting is the Popular Front government also could have, many scholars argue, done much more to beat back Franco's fascist forces. Would they have given the union and the workers arms? But they didn't do that readily because they were worried that there was going to be a revolution, which there was. Whether the Popular Front government had and those involved had things to fear. Maybe if they were protecting their class power, that's probably the case. But they did not. But as a result of dithering, they gave Franco time and space to do things in advance, make certain military advances that he otherwise might not have, which ultimately ended up in his attaining power. And
so speaking of government fears, I'm curious, and you may not know this, but how is the Spanish Revolution looked back on or taught in history classes in Spain now? Is it this moment in their history that they glorify? Is it something they don't talk about at all? Has it sort of been cut out of history? Or is it something that's vilified as this dangerous moment where the country almost went the wrong way?
As far as I know, some of the more recent social movements have drawn loosely on that tradition and cited Spanish anarchist organizing circa 1936, like the 15M movement, the Spanish Indignados, for example. But in terms of public education, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, right. And I'd just be interested in how that's. So my sort of assumption is that it's just sort of left aside. But of course, when you have that large of a participation in a group like CNT in the Revolution, that you can't completely push that history aside without leaving giant holes in history. So I'm just interested in how that's been incorporated into the current education system. But I understand you do not have the information to elaborate.
Although it's interesting to note the way in which English language scholars have looked back on the revolution. So I mentioned the critique of Eric Hobsbawm's work with respect to the Spanish Revolution leveled by Noam Chomsky and Murray Bookchin. And so Chomsky, in the one chapter that deals with the Spanish Civil War in his book On Anarchism, he cites Hobsbawm and really takes him to task because Hobsbawm, like I said, attributed the failure of the revolution due to the anarchists. That's the way that he put it. And that he labeled the anarchist revolution a disaster, replete with moral gymnastics, and merely a profoundly moving spectacle for the student of popular religion. So somewhat dismissive and derogatory comments from Hobsbawm in an article that he wrote for the New Left Review. And Chomsky tries to sort of provide an alternate interpretation, to say the least. He, of course, recognizes the widespread and spontaneous revolution that ensued from July through September of 1936. And even later than that, actually, George Orwell, who wrote Homage to Catalonia, he did not visit Spain until December, I don't think. So there was already like there were already counter-revolutionary currents in place. And Chomsky breaks it down, the counter-revolution, into a couple phases. So the first phase started when the central government fell increasingly under communist control, and under control of the communist-led PSUC, the United Socialist Party of Catalonia, largely as a result of Russian military assistance. And the party organized the Peasant Federation that served wealthy landowners and checked the collectivization process. So while many of the peasants, a significant number, if not the majority, and I think it's probably fair to say that at some point the majority at least acted as though they supported collectivization, with the support of the centralized Communist Party, who organized this Peasant Federation, they were able to sort of beat that back. And the first phase of the counter-revolution, according to Chomsky, involved the legalization and regulation of some of these spontaneous initiatives, the collectivization and workers' control. On October 7th, the Communist Minister of Agriculture legalized the expropriations that were made. So he legalized what had already taken place, in effect. and this was lauded by the communist press, who, by the way, George Orwell takes to task in his book, Homage to Catalonia. And I think Chomsky's right, too. I'll just to mention this before I forget, that it's sort of difficult to look back now, given the mass anti-communist propaganda and ideology that has come to that so long predominated in the United States, to look at this in a way that fully recognizes the extent to which the Communist Party actually functioned in a very counter-revolutionary way, but without just turning it into an argument that's conducive to capitalist anti-communist rhetoric. And so with that October 7th decree that legalized those expropriations, celebrated by the communist press, it exempted landlords who didn't participate in the Franco Rebellion, and the CNT criticized this move. Tenants had to continue paying rent to landowners who didn't join with Franco as a result of that legislation. And then there was... yeah, go ahead.
I don't know if you know this, but so how was that... What constituted joining Franco as a landlord?
And in fact, I should maybe reword that slightly so it was less joining. It was more just like supporting or tacitly supporting.
Okay.
And so essentially reaffirming exploitative social relations there is in effect what that legislation did, because the tenants had to continue paying rent to the rentier class if they didn't in some way support Franco, which, I mean, again, I think the communists were making a concerted effort to beat back Franco, which others weren't, like the United States and Great Britain, which I'll talk about in a second. But yet they still reaffirm the legitimacy of those rentier relations.
Right, which in most communist analysis would not be legitimate in the first place.
Yeah. And then so in the second stage of the counter-revolution, from October 1936 to May 1937, there was destruction of local committees. Militia was replaced by conventional army. The anarchist organized militias were replaced by conventional army, and there was a reestablishment of the old economic system. There was another collectivization decree that freed industry from workers' control, and it was as a result of that, or part and parcel with it, communist-led armies swept through Aragon and destroyed the collectives, and they brought the area and part of the economy under control of the central government. There was a plan announced by Pravda, the Russian communist organ, on December 17th, 1936, that said, quote, "So far as Catalonia is concerned, the cleaning up of Trotskyist and Anarcho-Syndicalist elements there has already begun, and it will be carried out there with the same energy as in the USSR." Indeed.
How terrifying.
Yeah, yeah. And then so the Negrin government, which was elected soon after, they suppressed the PUM, which was the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, which was much more sympathetic to the anarchists, and that's actually the party that controlled the armed forces that Orwell was a part of. He was with the PUM, and the Negrin government suppressed them. And so actually, come May, when there was an attempt by the communist government or communist officials to take back the worker-controlled, I think, a telephone station. That resulted in like all sorts of street battles in May. That was with the CNT and the government, or at least the more radical elements of the CNT that still wanted to carry forth the revolution, and it ended up in again mass suppression and repression, and. Co-evolved with all this, there was consolidation of centralized control in Catalonia. The Negrin government dissolved the anarchist-organized municipal councils. Communist officer Enrique Lister enforced dissolution and dismantling of the collectives, and further affirmed centralized governmental control. The local anarchist press was also suppressed in favor of a communist organ. The local anarchist centers were forcefully shut down. Like I mentioned, the telephone station during the mass uprising in May, and then there was a government-imposed censorship. Now, I mentioned the lack of purported neutrality of Great Britain and the United States. So, while both were, again, supposed to have assumed this neutral position, even from the beginning, that wasn't the case. So, with Great Britain, there was a British naval action in the Straits of Gibraltar right after the attempted coup that determined, it ended up blocking rebel ships from making key movements that would enable them to retake fascist-controlled territory, and aided Franco's rebels. And then so in May 1938, as after most of the revolutionary impetus had been crushed, the British ambassador to Spain, Sir Henry Clinton, claimed Franco's victory was necessary for peace and order. And I think he qualified that in some ways, saying that, like, for whatever reason, it might not be in Britain's best interest, which is similar to what Winston Churchill, famous British politician who was Prime Minister 1940, 1945, and 1951 to 1955, he'd said that, quote, "Franco has all the right on his side because he loves his country. Also, Franco is defending Europe against the communist danger, if you wish to put it in those terms." But then he said he'd prefer the other side wins, meaning, of course, that the Republican government, and certainly not the anarchists, because he was very happy to see those folks crushed. But he hoped the other side wins because Franco could potentially threaten British economic interests. And German sources from the time claimed Britain supplied Franco with munitions and gave Germany info on Russian armed deliveries to the Republic. And the U.S. also assumed a less than neutral position, despite the pronouncements from the government. The American government urged the Martin Aircraft Company not to honor agreements that were made with the Spanish Republican government prior to Franco's attempted coup that would have supplied the Republic with an aircraft to use in the Civil War, and it pressured the Mexican government not to ship the Spanish Republic war materials purchased by the United States. And then U.S.-based Texaco Oil Company violated contracts it had with the Spanish Republic and went ahead and shipped oil to Franco. 5 tankers in the high seas in July 1936 actually were diverted to Franco as soon as the attempted coup took place, and the fascists then received $6 million worth of oil on credit, courtesy of the U.S.-based corporation. And the American press were, of course, virtually silent about most of this, which is interesting. Like I mentioned, Orwell's homage to Catalonia. He went there in order to do journalistic work to begin with, but ended up fighting in the Civil War and was actually shot in the neck in this sort of fluke happening. It was really weird because most of the time, according to his account, they just spent in the trenches, and were the main concern in war was not to get shot, although that was one of the concerns, but it actually took a backseat to trying to stay warm because it was just fucking cold, evidently. And one of the things that he did in that book, Homage to Catalonia, was quote at length some of the communist press, which completely distorted events, and also he lambasted the lack of foreign press coverage, which he suggests might have allowed for more working class solidarity if people elsewhere knew what was going on, and a lot of people didn't. And a lot of people, of course, in the U.S. still do not know, in the U.S. and most of the West, even those who veer towards more progressive and radical politics. It's an episode in history that in many ways has been largely forgotten, in no small part thanks to the press coverage at the time and subsequent press coverage, as well as, or lack thereof, or misrepresentation thereof, or to the liberal scholarship that Chomsky critiques in his book. And before we wrap up, I did want to quickly touch on some of the limitations to the CNT-FAI organization, or at least potential limitations. These were some of the issues raised by Murray Bookchin, for example, and others, but Bookchin being the most critical, and I agree with him to a large extent that it is important to be very self-reflective about these sort of things. So even when your values and ideas align with a particular movement, or if you want to use the term ideology, like you should still be, thinking about what that ideology actually entails and how is it functioning ideologically in the more traditional sense to obscure things and obfuscate the real world and actually prevent, in a lot of cases, prevent a more successful revolutionary occurrence.
And certainly, and as events and the context change, like the ideology might have to change with it to account for those changes, which of course, if you are not being reflexively critical, you're not going to capture those moments.
Yeah, so Bookchin was a communist Stalinist of sorts for a long while. I mean, not slavishly devoted to Stalin or anything, but he was, like much of the working class, very sympathetic and saw and hoped for a real communist revolution that would be advanced from the Soviet Union and those that were working in the same vein. Then he switched over to a kind of Trotskyism because he realized the horrors that were carried out by Stalin with his purges and with the industrialization schemes and the way that ended up actually destroying much of the population. But good for industry in some ways. And he switched over to Trotskyism, and he now in trying to explain, or when he was writing and speaking, before dying a few years back, he tried to, chart the evolution in his thought toward more anti-authoritarian anarchist perspectives. And he notes that Trotsky had said, before being killed by Stalin's thugs when he was in Mexico, that if a socialist revolution did not ensue after World War II, which everybody thought it would, all the socialists were sure that, there was a revolution was imminent. Socialism was impending. But if for some crazy reason that was not to happen, then what would be necessary would be a total rethinking of Marxian analysis and Marxist thought, which I think Bookchin undertook to do. And so as far as the limitations to CNT-FAI organizing, and I think he takes these considerations, Bookchin took these considerations very seriously, because he was thinking through what the relevance of anarchist organizing and anarcho-syndicalist organizing would be for the present. And one of the things that he mentions was that there were higher committees that started preempting local initiatives, and decisions required the authorization from those up above, which, if the union was functioning in accord with some of its professed values, like it had in its more libertarian beginnings, there wouldn't have even been an up above. Like, that hierarchy would not have been in place, but partly in reaction to the pressures from the communist encroachments and, of course, the Civil War and the less than helpful efforts of Western liberal democracies, they started accepting forms of centralization that were quite antithetical to some of their values. And some of the anarcho-syndicalist union leaders entered the Catalan government, which furthered centralization. It increased the political bureaucracy and ended up fully supplanting authority of workers' committees. Something that Peter Marshall points out is that initially the CNT had made the crucial decision to leave the Generalitat, the provisional government of Catalonia, intact. And they're criticized by some Marxists for this too, and perhaps also some anarchists, for when they had the chance not declaring the government abolished and pronouncing the end of the state and, go ahead and instituting formally an anarcho-syndicalist society, whether that in some way legitimizes the government itself inadvertently, or that would have inadvertently legitimized the government, is I guess debatable. And then what's ironic, though, is they later, like I said, collaborated with the Catalan government and also President Luis Companys, and then under the Negrin administration, they also took, as Bookchin points out, these sort of adjunct ministerial positions. The 4 leaders of the CNT became ministers of the socialist government, I guess first under Largo Caballero in December, and even the anarchist intellectual Federica Montseny became Minister of Health, for example. And another criticism that Bookchin has, he argues that much in line with his libertarian municipalist praxis, that the anarcho-syndicalists in Spain failed by not having more local level assemblies, and that they should have had more national and regional conferences. What do you make of that? What do you make of the emphasis on the assembly form of organization and its importance for facilitating direct democratic transformation of society?
Well, I think that is essential. Largely because, as I said, as you get more and more people, let's say, participating in state projects, as you were talking about, or creating a more centralized structure, it changes some of their goals. When you're in the decentralized area, your goals are always held to the people's interest. That is their current interest, their current... even if that interest fluctuates, of course, their inclinations, like, is pulled back. But once you've calcified an institution, particularly one that has some hierarchical notions, then that institution, a bunch of the projects that delegates would be performing is about maintaining that institution just in its institutional role, which
it assumes its own extraneous logic.
Exactly.
And so it's power over those who it is supposed to empower.
Exactly. And so then you have a divergence of interests, because sometimes what is institutionally beneficial may not be what the workers at the more decentralized level were interested in, or even contrary to some of their desires. And I mean, history has shown this over and over again. It's been the common anarchist critique of the more statist solutions of the communist and socialist, is that the bureaucrats and those higher on the hierarchy are going to necessarily slowly distance themselves from the interest of those who do not have the means to manipulate the bureaucracy in their way.
It reminded me of a point that Akim Bey, Peter Lamborn Wilson, anarchist thinker, made in one talk that he was giving based on some of his writing, that, and I think possibly guilty of some overgeneralization, but that institutions, and I guess I would add, much like you, institutions that become very calcified, we could parse out what that means, but I imagine people have some idea, that their initial objectives and goals that people want to realize, and establish the institution for those reasons in order to realize those goals and facilitate movement towards realizing those goals, or doing the things and coordinating in the way that they want to coordinate, because of the inherent logic or nature of institutions, especially what we might qualifyingly refer to as calcified institutions. They end up actually performing functions diametrically opposed to those goals and objectives and stated desires for actually institutionalizing to begin with. So, for example, education now makes you dumb, or medicine makes you sick, or something like that, which is obviously this oversimplification, but more than a modicum of truth to it, of course.
And with that, one of the key goals of so there's a long history within communist socialist thought of the withering away of the state, brought to it by Lenin, I believe, originally. But you can see what happened with that history within the CNT was that wasn't necessary, right? Like, you didn't need to wither away the state because it was already not there in the organization process.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until the communists got involved, and also then some CNT members joined the government, joined these things, then suddenly you added this extra requirement for your future values of, now we need to make this bureaucracy eventually wither away, when if they just wouldn't have started engaging in such activities, engaging in such institutional and hierarchical frameworks, they wouldn't have had to then hope that eventually, get rid of them, because they were functioning just fine before without them.
Bookchin also added that the confusion over the locus of decision-making caused problems, and so he argues that the decision-making for the key aspects of people's lives, the immediate aspects of people's lives, should have been in the shop assemblies and regional congresses or conferences with mandated delegates. And both Bookchin and others have also faulted, in some ways, the Iberian Anarchist Federation, the more radical element that joined with the CNT and visibilized itself after the 1930s, after the onset of the revolution in 1936, that the love and camaraderie that fostered their radicalization, it often would veer in the direction of demanding conformity, and also oftentimes it took the form of hyper-masculine propaganda, or propaganda by the deed type terrorism, which had a hyper-masculine element. So that's one of the, I would say, recurring tensions within radical organizations, especially insurrectionary organizations, it would seem that because you're acting within an egregiously violent society and oftentimes adopting tactics and strategies because you exist within that violent society that you want to change, that that you cannot implement all of the what you might call nonviolent or more affectively oriented types of human relations that don't have the same kind of maiming, distorting qualities that you see in society. You can't begin with those right away because, one, those aren't the ones that have been inculcated, and two, there's a war going on, essentially. But then there's, of course, the issue of emulating the same structures and strategies and tactics that are propagated and perpetuated and reproduced by the dominant society of domination.
And one of the key points you made earlier that stuck out to me when you were reading the history was the remilitarization. When you talked about the communists brought back the military structure, which obviously the whole time during the revolution, like, the war had been being fought by this non-hierarchical, like, sort of decentralized councils and collectives of laborers, and so that the idea that hierarchy was necessary in order to effectively fight was extremely problematic, because one of the things that brings back is, as opposed to when you were talking about participatory decision-making, is instead the opposite then, is obedience becomes the means of success, as opposed to pulling out the creative potential of the workers and their ideas, which I think is a key point where you're going to reverse any gains that you've made by switching people's roles from agents of the revolution to cogs in a revolutionary machine, right? Which is how the military ends up working, with its soldiers just taking orders, fulfilling roles, without themselves making the war and the revolution.
One of the other drawbacks to CNT organization was that it was in some ways exclusive, and that, as people like Martha Acklesberg have argued, didn't adequately address the concerns of women workers or fully support equality for women, both inside and outside the union structures. Not only that, like I said, it was more exclusive in other ways, so they initially only permitted wage workers who worked under or for a boss, which already excluded, say, cooperative producers and some of the very few existing collectives that were there, and it pushed compliance with majority decisions, possibly at the expense of individual inquiry or autonomous action that would conflict with it. And there was a general acceptance that there'd be no public criticism of the union, which is an interesting principle from which people were expected to adhere to, because in some ways it's understandable, because there is a repressive machine, repressive state machinery and private enterprise that does not want to tolerate meaningful dissent that's going to actually act upon it, and that would do anything it could to undermine CNT organization and also aggravate any fractures within it that it could identify, but yet at the same time you could only think that there'd be a sort of gross silencing effect and elimination of dissidents within the organization, and that would likely contribute to the kind of institutional and ideological calcification that starts inverting the efforts and goals and objectives of those involved.
And interesting, of course, when you eliminate criticism, you do more than just eliminate like oppositional or insulting sort of claims and proposals, but you also eliminate potentially like new ideas, right? Which could be greatly beneficial to the organization or whatever. But because they are an alternative, or because they might, poke at with certain issues they have with the current policies or current way things are going, might fall under that net of, oh, you're criticizing us, you can't do that, but you're actually eliminating very real potential for profitable change.
Yeah, and some of that self-criticism took place intra-organizationally, but because there were some 25 million people in Spain and only roughly 1 million people in the CNT at its peak, there's a whole broader population that is going to in some way have to be involved if you're revolutionizing this society. And you'd want them, I would think, especially if you're trying to, in the case of a union like this, increase membership or help disseminate these ideas and also develop them in ways that are going to be much more practicable and more liberatory, then you'd want the broader public also to be participating in this kind of dialogue.
And you mentioned before the early requirements of being a wage laborer under a boss, which cuts out the lumpen proletariat, anyone who was unemployed or disabled and unable to participate in the workforce, then cannot participate in your revolution, which is not what you want. Do you want everyone who is able and willing to be participating?
And later on, they did allow for participation from those who weren't just wage workers, and they also had certain cultural centers and other things and assemblies that allowed for that broader participation. But there was that exclusive element, especially in the beginning, and then after a couple months of the revolution, with the centralizing tendencies. There was some scale back in that too,
and I would even potentially argue that it's very likely that those beginning filters and exclusivity that were being made sort of sets the foundation for certain people who were there from the beginning having more influence and more power, which pushes the organization towards that more centralized force, even if informally, just in those people that have been there the longest because they were allowed at first to join, having the most influence.
So as not to end on a bad note, and also to segue into something that sort of helps expound upon this last line of thought, the anarchists in Spain also, as Martha Ackelsberg repeatedly emphasized, they made concerted efforts to simultaneously do community-based activism in addition to the union-based activism. So like I mentioned before, they had their traveling militant anarchist pedagogues, which were also known as obreros conscientes, and there were formations of rationalist schools, or Escuela Moderna, modern school, which was founded by Francisco Ferrer y Gardia, or better known as just Francisco Ferrer. And they had Ateneos, which were the neighborhood and educational cultural centers, which were started by the CNT locals, I think in part precisely to promote this kind of broader participation among those who didn't fit into the wage worker industrial union structure. And those Ateneos also, those involved in those organizations also made sure to appeal to the broader community and involve them with things like community theater, recreation, and field trips. They would organize field trips from the city to the countryside and take long hikes and stop every hour and a half or so and drink wine and read militant anarchist literature, which I think is just incredibly beautiful. They also took very seriously this idea of cambio de mentalidad, which is essentially what we talked about before, this consciousness raising, consciousness change, and the necessity of it for revolution. And probably the most important long-term counter-institution were those Ateneos that created this form of community empowerment. And it also enabled the CNT and this anarcho-syndicalist ethos to remain in existence during those periods of oppression when the unions were, at least on the surface, obliterated and forced underground because they weren't formally associated with the union. Although there was, of course, that implicit association, and the union was responsible for their formations to begin with, or at least anarchists involved with the union were responsible. And then, of course, something that's always of interest to me, media, radical media. There were all kinds of anarchist organs in addition to the CNT's official ones. So, for example, I think there's a great journal article that discusses the impact of these different types of anarchist press. And so you had like Soledad Obrera, you had Revista Blanca, and they featured everything from scathing critiques of concentrated power to recipes for vegan cooking to ideas on how to best treat sexually transmitted diseases. So that's another thing, not the sexually transmitted diseases, but it reminds me that the anarchists also were lifestyle anarchists. They promoted free love, for example, and a complete reconceptualization of the institution of marriage and what that meant, whether within that institution itself or transcending it in lots of ways with the different kinds of relationships that were considered, just as much a part of the revolution as any of the other social and economic changes. But the media too provided this route in for those who weren't based in real anarchist strongholds to read about and learn and get intrigued by these anarchist ideas, and perhaps start their own autonomous anarchist
wine and reading groups.
Yes. and so finally, I wanted to end with one last Murray Bookchin thought. Like I said before, he noted the decline of the collectivist tradition, but that how it was the anarchist revolution took place at a time before it had been completely annihilated, and that migration of former agrarian workers to the cities as a result of enclosures and privatization schemes helped foment a particular kind of critical consciousness and praxis. But with the absence of that collectivist tradition today, and maybe a parallel in the decline of the nuclear family and also urban atomization, not even just urban, there's widespread isolation and atomization as a result of markets and commodities and thinking in accord with markets and commodities that permeates virtually every aspect of our lives. So Bookchin suggests, because of these things, that there might be new relevance for the commune. Do you think he's onto something?
What new relevance would he be?
Perhaps not new, but renewed relevance. So, because of the fact that we all, not all, but many feel isolated and atomized and alone, and of course disenfranchised, where you have virtually, according to a study that was done by a Princeton University scholar and another scholar at Northwestern, 70% of the United States population virtually has no say on the major decisions that are made at the national level. So extreme disenfranchisement. Again, there's extreme concentration of economic power. The 1% controls roughly 40% of the wealth in the United States. The richest 80 people in the world own just about as much wealth as the bottom half, the bottom 3.5 billion.
Combined.
Yeah, combined. And so that economic power, like we mentioned before, almost reflexively wields greater political power, hence the greater disenfranchisement in this vicious cycle. And so people feel like they don't have any say in the decisions that are impacting their lives, and they feel isolated from one another. And so the commune, or the assembly more generally in Bookchin's mind is one platform where people can reconnect and reassert a sense and practice of collective agency.
Yeah, and I think that is essential, and that creating that collective agency also solves his criticism of lifestyle anarchism. As you were talking about, like the several anarchist participants in the CNT were very much lifestyle anarchists, but the difference in the lifestyle anarchism Bookchin was criticizing it was that it internalized that atomization and individualism, that you personally just change your consumer habits, you live a friendly life and treat people as equals, would bring about the revolution, which of course isn't going to happen. But when you make it a more communal activity to where you are working with others to create lifestyles, for instance, that are allowing for gender liberation and allowing for the expression of ethics that are just straight off the market under capitalism, like things like animal rights or environmental issues, then I think that you can have that lifestyle anarchism merged with a revolutionary project in a way that I don't think Bookchin would find problematic.
Well, I think that about wraps it up for our history of anarchism in Spain and the Anarcho-Syndicalist revolution during the Spanish Civil War. Kody, was there anything that you wanted to add?
No, I think that was a well-said history.
Pretty good talk. Maybe we'll do it again sometime.
Sounds good.